On Thursday, the 23rd of June 2016, the United Kingdom will hold a referendum on its membership of the European Union. The question on the ballot will be, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? This video will explain what the European Union is and how it works, why the referendum is happening, what the arguments are, whether these arguments make any sense, and end with a brief discussion of the polls. This video isn't produced by any campaign, and it's not going to recommend which way you should vote. It seeks to be an objective analysis that will evaluate the claims being made and clearly explain the potential benefits and consequences for each outcome. So should the United Kingdom leave the European Union? The European Union, also known as the EU, is a way for its 28 member states to cooperate with one another in the pursuit of common political and economic goals. To explain how it works, here is a brief overview of the areas, institutions, and treaties of the EU. Areas. The European Union is not to be confused with the Eurozone, which are the countries that use the euro as their currency, or the European Single Market, which facilitates the free movement of goods and services, or the European Economic Area, which is the European Single Market plus the EU's non-member trading partners, or the European Union Customs Union, which is all of the European Economic Area plus Turkey and a few other territories that are exempt from customs duties. Additionally, the borderless Schengen area consists of these 26 states, but the remaining 4 are legally obligated to join. It's important to note that states outside of the European Union are politically powerless. They can be members of the Eurozone, the Economic Area, the Customs Union, or the Schengen area, but they have no representation in the European Parliament and have no say in how any of these agreements are changed. Institutions. In total, there are 7 institutions of the European Union, but the ones we're most interested in are the ones involved in passing new European laws. The way it works is every 5 years and in 2 separate elections, voters from the United Kingdom directly elect their own government and their representatives to the European Parliament. Ministers from the government then join the Council of the EU, and the Prime Minister joins the European Council. The European Council, after electing their President, then proposes the members and President of the European Commission, which are voted on by the European Parliament. The European Commission then proposes new legislation, which both the European Parliament and the Council of the EU can vote up or down. If the United Kingdom doesn't like the political direction of European legislation, the UK members of the European Parliament can vote it down, the UK members of the Council can vote it down, or the Prime Minister can propose new members of the European Commission. If the electorate of the United Kingdom doesn't like what their representatives have done, they can replace them at the ballot box every 5 years. The United Kingdom currently holds the 3rd most representatives to the European Parliament after France and Germany. Treaties. These define what the European Union is and does. The original purpose was to unite Europe after the damage caused by 2 world wars, a task in which it has arguably succeeded, but since then a succession of treaties have somewhat changed the size and scope of the project. The Treaty of Rome established the European Economic Community in 1958, which was joined by the UK in 1973. The Schengen Agreement then abolished border checks, to which the UK and Ireland were granted an opt-out, and the Maastricht Treaty created the Euro, to which the UK was granted an opt-out. And then there's the Charter of Fundamental Rights, to which the UK was granted an opt-out. The Amsterdam Treaty made some changes to the Maastricht Treaty, effectively devolving certain powers to the European Parliament, as well as making the Schengen Agreement mandatory for new members of the EU. This has important consequences for the UK should it decide to vote leave. The Nice Treaty attempted to reform both the Treaties of Rome and Maastricht to accommodate eastward expansion, but was criticised as being overly complicated, which finally led to the Treaty of Lisbon, effective 2009, which made some substantial changes. Notably, the Treaty of Rome is now the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the Treaty of Maastricht is now the Treaty on European Union, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights is now legally binding to all member states. So now these are the only 2 treaties which matter, and they set out the constitutional basis for the European Union. What's important to note here is that membership with any of these zones effectively imposes European legislation on the United Kingdom whether or not it's a member of the EU. Membership of the EU presently grants the United Kingdom substantial political influence over Europe, and membership of the Euro, the Schengen area and the Charter of Fundamental Rights will be mandatory for all new members of the EU. So why is this referendum happening? First and foremost, it's because the Conservative Party promised to hold one if they won the 2015 general election, in an attempt to garner support from nationalists. 3 parties promised a referendum on EU membership in their manifestos, and all, except for the UK Independence Party, want the UK to remain in the EU. Secondly, it's because the Treaty of Lisbon included, for the first time, the legal framework necessary to actually leave. Prior to 2009, this was not an option. Finally, it's because the European Union has actually changed substantially since the United Kingdom joined in 1973. Though each treaty has been ratified by the duly elected government of the United Kingdom, comparatively little about the European Union as it exists in 2016 resembles the European Economic Community that the UK joined in 1973. So what are the arguments for leaving the EU? Arguments for and against EU membership tend to centre around three core issues: immigration, economy, and sovereignty. Here we'll briefly discuss the central arguments in favour of leaving the EU, along with some of the data these claims are derived from. Immigration. Those who wish to leave the EU argue that immigration rates are too high and that because EU citizens have the right to live and work in any member state, membership of the EU prevents the UK from denying entry to European citizens. The 2015 European migrant crisis has sharply increased immigration throughout Europe, and it is claimed that there is an unsustainable influx of migrants into the UK. Data from the Office for National Statistics shows that for the year ending 2015, the net migration rate, which is the difference between immigration and emigration, amounted to an additional 330,000 people entering the UK each year. In total, the population of the UK has risen by about 6 million people since the Schengen Agreement established European citizenship in 1995, though a substantial portion of this rise is unrelated to immigration. Current estimates put the number of EU citizens in the UK at approximately 3.3 million, and the number of UK citizens with residency in Europe at about 1.2 million. Trade and the economy. The most prevalent financial argument for leaving the EU largely revolves around the cost of EU membership, which the Vote Leave campaign claims to be £350 million per week, or about £18 billion per year. But it should be noted that this figure is wrong. According to both the UK Treasury and the Office for National Statistics, the correct value post-rebate is about £13 billion. And because the EU offers the UK £4.4 billion in farm subsidies and other programmes, the UK's net contribution to the EU is actually in the order of £8.5 billion per year, not 18. Nevertheless, the argument is that this money, whatever the amount, would be of greater benefit to the UK economy if it were spent domestically. The UK's annual net contribution of £8.5 billion currently represents about 0.5% of the UK's gross national income of $2.8 trillion, which is comparable to its foreign aid budget of £12.2 billion, currently set at 0.7% of GNI. Another prominent economic argument for leaving the EU revolves around the UK's inability to control tariffs. Because the EU single market is a free trade area, a condition for participation is that the UK isn't allowed to raise tariffs against other EU states. And because the EU negotiates trade deals with the rest of the world as a single bloc, only the EU can raise tariffs against non-EU states. So when cheap Chinese steel flooded onto the European markets in early 2016, former Mayor of London and Vote Leave campaigner Boris Johnson argued that the collapse of Tata Steel could have been averted had the UK been able to control its own tariffs. In principle, this is a reasonable argument, but as we'll shortly discover, the situation is slightly more complicated. Presently, the European Union accounts for 44% of the UK's exports and represents 53% of its imports in goods and services. UK sovereignty and EU laws. Sovereignty arguments for leaving the EU attempt to make the case that the principle of absolute self-governance is inherently valuable, or that delegating authority to Europe often leads to unfavourable outcomes for the UK. Common arguments involve stressing the number of laws imposed on the UK by the EU, which Vote Leave claims is over 50%, stressing the idea that other states have undue political influence over the UK, or implying that the EU is woefully undemocratic. Depending on precisely how the term law is defined, it's possible to justify any measure between 15 and 50% of legislation as originating from the EU, with higher estimates classifying all EU regulation, including conditions for membership of the single market, as laws. Vote Leave's estimate of more than half can be considered correct, but it can only be used as an argument for leaving if the UK doesn't then join the EU single market, as doing so would simply reapply the vast majority of these laws to the UK. Are any of these good reasons to leave the EU? Some of them might be, but it depends on what you value, why you value it, and which outcomes you're trying to achieve. The population of the UK has been steadily rising for many decades, and whilst the rate of growth has increased due to immigration, leaving the EU probably wouldn't have as great an effect as Vote Leave imagines, and it could actually create more problems than it solves. As we can see, immigration only accounts for about half of the rise in the UK's population, and only about half of that immigration is actually from the EU. So at best this would only solve quarter of the problem, and that's if you accept that it's a problem at all. Additionally, there are 1.2 million UK citizens living in Europe who would have their EU citizenships revoked. Another problem created by leaving the EU is the potential revocation of what are known as juxtaposed controls. As it stands, the 1951 Geneva Conventions have established that asylum must be granted to refugees who reach UK soil. But the 1993 Le Touquet Treaty with France allows the UK to pull a clever trick whereby the border is effectively moved into Europe, acting as a barrier to refugees from ever reaching UK soil in order to make a claim. Leaving the EU is likely to nullify this agreement, which would collapse the border back down to the coast and allow refugees to try their luck unimpeded. Once they reach UK soil, they cannot be forcibly returned to their country of origin without the UK violating the Geneva Conventions. Finally, there's the issue of Scotland. A Brexit will almost certainly trigger another Scottish referendum on independence, which, judging from how favourably they see the EU, is rather likely to succeed. Aside from the irony of independence causing the United Kingdom to break up, this has serious consequences for immigration because an independent Scotland will absolutely seek to join the EU, and as we learned earlier, the Amsterdam Treaty has made it a legal requirement for new member states to join both the Euro and the Schengen area. The Scottish border will, by law, then be open to Europe and immigrants will be able to freely enter England and Wales via Scotland. Presently, the UK enjoys a position of remarkable privilege in the EU. If the issue of immigration is important to you, be aware of the problems that leaving is likely to create. The bottom line on the economic situation is high risk, low reward with plenty of uncertainty. Nobody really knows what will happen if the UK leaves the EU. Perhaps the economy will do better, or perhaps it'll enter a recession. Either way, it's safe to say that both the end times prophecy by Stronger In and the pot of gold promised by Vote Leave are embellishments of the truth. It's certainly plausible that the UK's annual contribution to the EU could provide some net economic benefit to the UK economy, but it's also true that this effect would be small because £8.5 billion plus or minus the value of the farm subsidies isn't really that much money to the world's 9th largest economy. Foreign aid costs the UK £12.2 billion per year. The UK's national debt costs £30 billion per year. Regarding trade, Boris is correct that leaving the EU would, in principle, allow the UK to set its own tariffs against cheap Chinese steel, but what he's neglecting to mention is that the UK doesn't want to. In fact, the UK blocked early EU efforts to raise tariffs against Chinese steel because the UK economy benefits enormously from cheap construction materials. The demise of Tata Steel is a direct consequence of free markets and conservative economic policies, not Europe. There's also the question of whether the UK should join the European single market in the event of a Brexit. Vote Leave are evasive on this issue and appear to err on the side of no, but the reality here is that it's not up to them, it's up to the UK government, who undoubtedly will seek to join the European single market. The cost of doing so is unclear, but it'll be based on the size of the UK economy, and since Norway's contribution is €656 million per year, less $100 million in science and research grants, it doesn't look good. The UK could very well end up paying in excess of £4 billion per year. That said, this is less than current contributions. All of which somewhat blunts the sovereignty argument, since remaining in the single market and trading with Europe requires adherence to a substantial amount of EU legislation. The UK will have a reduced regulatory burden after leaving the EU, but at the cost of all of its considerable political influence. The UK is currently allocated 73 of the 751 seats in the European Parliament, which is 10%. That's equal to the bottom 9 countries combined. That said, most people find the European political system confusing. Not everyone who understands it likes it, and the UK doesn't always get its way, but that's politics. Those who place high value on nationalism and sovereignty tend to believe that we can get along with ourselves far better than with the rest of Europe. But judging from the polls, that might be overly optimistic. What do the polls say? Reading polls is a lot like divining tea leaves, especially when the numbers are this close, but the aggregate appears to lean toward the UK remaining in the EU, though this really can go either way. Polls taken in Scotland are much more definitive, with a clear preference for Remain. Any British, Irish or Commonwealth citizen who is resident in the UK over 18 and registered can vote, meaning that any Canadian, Indian, Australian or South African resident in the UK at the time of the referendum is able to vote. EU citizens living in the UK are not able to vote. Referendums in the UK are extremely rare, and to date only 2 countrywide referendums have ever been held. One to ratify the UK's membership of the European Economic Area in 1975, and one on the alternative vote in 2011. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, you can support more content like this through Patreon.